there's of course a 250 crore penalty. And
150 crores.
yes,
Okay,
250
you just said it as though it was not much.
and a model is such that it's not like you can take half of it and carve it out. The whole thing is junk.
What are the most common misconceptions that you hear about DPDP?
The easiest way I explain this to, my mom or someone who doesn't get this is, once your data is out there, your bank balance is going to be zero.
Welcome to the Neural Talks, your gateway to the forefront of AI innovation. I'm your host, Ranjit Malarkot, and together we'll explore the AI revolution with the brightest minds pushing boundaries and shaping the future. Through candid conversations, they share hard-won insights as we unlock the transformative power of AI. Get informed, get inspired. This is the future, and you're in the front row. So the DPDP Act was enacted in August 2023 in India, and the final rules are expected anytime this year. 90% of Indian startups have launched AI features, right? Only 9% of organizations understand DPDP compliance. And with penalties of 250 crores, we are facing what we call the AI compliance countdown. So to discuss this today, we have the perfect person for you. We have Amruta Moktali. She's the CPO of Skyflow. Welcome back, Amruta, to our podcast.
Thanks, Ranjit. It's awesome to be here. As you mentioned, I am the Chief Product Officer of Skyflow. We just live, breathe about data privacy. How can you use sensitive customer data in a privacy preserving manner? And now in the age of AI, we are all about, runtime AI data security. And I've been in the data world for quite some time. I'll age myself if I start talking about all the things I've done. But yeah, it's exciting to come and talk more about AI and how we do it right.
No, that's absolutely very pertinent today, especially for India, where we have so many enterprises and startups building with AI and in AI. So, Amrita, you've seen the digital boom, you've seen the AI boom at Salesforce. If you could give us a 30-second reality check, right? How urgent is DPDP compliance for enterprises and for AI builders building with AI today in India? That would be fantastic.
Um, DPDP is all about data protection. Now, if you truly think about the breaches that have happened in India recently, the star breach with health data that was happening. Now, India has moved to a very digital first world. With that becomes this risk of breach. And when we talk about breach, we are talking about sensitive data, your personal data, your financial data, all of that, your health data, all of that getting leaked. Now, with the extent of digital world that we are running into, DPDPA becomes very important because all it is about is how do you work and do everything that you're doing in a way that you don't leak any of this information, because then it falls in the wrong hands and then it's all gone, right? The easiest way I explain this to, my mom or someone who doesn't get this is, once your data is out there, your bank balance is going to be zero because that's what clicks to everyone. But at the
Yes,
end of
with
the day, it's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, with the number of scams that are going on and the bank balances dropping, it's just crazy. So,
It,
if you were to sort of walk us through
yeah.
where we are realistically with DPDP in India today, could you give us a snapshot of that?
So, see, DPDP came out like, the government has been thinking about this for a long time. Now we have all the rules listed out by the government, and they fall across three key themes, right? I mean, I don't remember all the rules, but the themes are more around consent. You want to be able to make sure that, you're collecting consent. You're most importantly enforcing that consent. You are, and that builds trust. Then you have protection, which is all about when you've gotten this data, how are you protecting it? How are you using it in a protected manner? And then third is control, which is all about not how you have control as a company of the data, but more about how you're giving controls, user rights to the end users whose data you're managing, right? Those are kind of the key themes of where the rules are. And I think what I'm observing is a lot of large companies, especially, and even the mid-sized companies in India now starting to take account of, okay, these are the rules, what's going on, what would we need to be prepared with when the government comes out with how they are going to enforce these rules, and they're already slowly starting to get prepared to be able to adhere to all of the rules that has been put out.
Okay, so sounds like a mix of user rights for consumers and also rights for internal users of businesses, and then also
Yes.
businesses putting a lot of governance around this. So I'm sure there's been a lot of talk, and there's been a lot of discussion around DPDP. You're in the thick of it. What are the most common misconceptions that you hear about DPDP?
The most common one is, it doesn't apply to me because I'm
Okay.
not collecting customers' data. That's the most common one that I hear, because they're
Okay.
like, I'm not collecting, someone's giving it to me. I'm not collecting the data. And that is the biggest misconception. Because based on the laws, it's all about how you're processing the data, handling the data as well. And then you are also responsible for making sure that it is, handled in the right way, right? You can't just say, okay, I got some chori ka paisa. I didn't steal it, but then you're still handling it and you're taking it somewhere. So I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions I've heard, because people are not understanding the definition of a data processor or a data fiduciary, which is not restricted to collection. I think that's one of the most common ones.
No, that's perfect. I mean, so maybe that's one of the areas we'll double click on, and sort of as we get into it. You've written about personal data sprawl. So could you explain to us how this affects AI companies or companies working with AI differently rather than traditional software companies?
Yes, and I think this is a big problem, and I'm glad we're talking about it. So when we talk about personal data sprawl, right, what we're talking about is data today is across so many systems,
Correct.
and we have given access to so many people. Like if I go and talk to any mid to large companies data person, like, yeah, I gave read all write all access because this person wanted it and we forgot about it. So at some point we don't know what has happened. And then what is now happening with AI is, not only do we have this data now going to a new system, we also have new data being unlocked, because AI has unlocked unstructured data that was never being used as much so far. And this data has a lot of information. So now you can just imagine that the risk surface has increased, because with AI, you have models, you have agents, you have MCP servers, you have so many different places where data is going. The other thing that people don't realize is we are also generating a lot of personal data very quickly. Imagine the number of interactions one person has with a model and how much personal data that has gone back and forth in a minute. So a single leak, or let's call it model misconfiguration, right, can expose a lot of data, because it's like one person now has everything. So I think when you think of like AI companies, the reason I wouldn't say think differently, because the data remains the same. We have to protect it the same way. The only way to think about it is, think about it as though the data is going in too many places very quickly, and you are not going to be able to know what has happened when, because once the model has data, it's very difficult for a model to forget something, right? If I tell a
Right.
model what my account number is, I can't make it unlearn.
Right. And
Right.
you don't know which context in which the model is going to use it, right? If it's a chatbot, you don't know which answer it's going to use it for.
Exactly. It's like some data is ephemeral, right? So that's where it becomes even more critical for AI companies to do it, because there's a complete different set of actors, as they're calling it, right, in the system now.
Yeah. So coming to actors, right? So that's what I want to demystify a little bit for our audiences. We see that there are some rules in DPDP for data localization for SDFs. Can you
Mhm.
explain to us what SDFs are, and what are the rules that sort of broadly apply to them?
Sure. And I'm not a legal person, so I have to give the disclaimer. Go check it out. But SDF basically stands for significant data fiduciaries.
Okay.
So think of like large banks and uh, you know telephony or whatever, right? These folks who have large volumes of data, and they have large volumes of extremely sensitive data. And there is, because then there is a high risk, even when a little bit part of that data is leaked. Then there is also data that they hold that may have national security implications. So this could even get into like airline, air traffic controllers. You can just think of all the different things. For example, even knowing where your gas and power lines and some things associated with that also comes under national risk. So these are the folks who are considered as SDFs, or significant data fiduciaries. Now, because of the type of data and the amount of data that they hold, the laws are a little more stricter for them,
Okay,
with respect to, and most of it is around, what, you're processing this kind of data, I want to make sure you're processing it in India. Make sure you are very careful when you're passing this data across border. What
got
is
it.
happening with that data? So those are the kind of the two big categories in which it's much more tighter and stricter when it comes to SDFs.
So if I'm a small or medium enterprise and I'm
Mhm.
processing some of this data, do I become an SDF or not really?
Not really. Not
Okay.
as you're starting, because it's all dependent. I mean, it's dependent on the large volumes of data
Okay.
and that. But the DPDPA still applies, but the SDF specific pieces may not apply as strictly. So,
Got it.
that's why we got to wait for the enforcement, because that's where we'll have more clarity on, what happens if an SDF breaches versus a non-SDF breach happens.
Yes, and they're certainly not very kind, which is what we'll get into in a bit. So, on data localization, just one more thing, right?
Yeah.
Today, AI companies are basically downloading models of the internet. They're using it. They're actually passing data to,
Yeah.
via APIs to internet. I mean, to internet hosted AI models.
Yes.
So, what is there a digital geo boundary that people building with AI have to now be aware of? And is there a way in which they should now certain data sets they should not be passing, certain data sets they should be passing? Could you help sort of demystify that?
Yeah, I think it's true. You have to truly think about it. And I'll give you an example from GDPR, as most of us
Okay,
know in EU, right? There
correct.
are laws where you cannot pass certain personal information outside of some country boundaries, or it cannot be viewed across. Now, when you think of exactly what you talked about, so let's say I'm using OpenAI model or any other Gemini, OpenAI, Claude that is hosted in the US, and I'm accessing it from India. And let's say that I am distilling the model, or I'm creating a version of it and I'm fine tuning it. And I'm now passing a bunch of, let's say, chat conversations into this model to fine tune it. Now you are passing personal data of citizens of India outside of Indian borders to another place. Now, that is what you want to be careful about. So, send the data, but anonymize it. Remove all the personal information, and then you can send that data. So, it's not restricting this cross border, it's about making sure you are not leaking sensitive information cross border. So, that's where the geo boundaries, if you say, we need to be aware of, and which is another thing when we talk about DPDPA with AI, that makes a big difference, because I talk to companies who are, oh, my model is here, but my data is coming from a different country. I'm like, well, what's going to happen then, right? You have to be careful
Correct.
what data is going where.
Yeah, I mean, they're both scenarios, and I'm glad that you actually pointed that out as well. So, a lot of nuances, I think, for people to actually, think about. But to get into a practical example, Amrita, and I'll get into the most common, example for AI today, right? I mean, so I'm building a chat bot. I'm
Yeah.
enabling this either with RAG or without RAG, and I'm putting this on, on the net. So, what are the top DPDP, landmines to avoid?
So if you're, let's say, building a chatbot for customer service, right? The first biggest thing is be careful of the collection of data that you're doing.
Okay.
So, because people will share all kinds of information, right? They don't know sometimes that they are sharing information that they don't know. So, there are two things you want to be aware of. Is when you're collecting data, make sure you're taking consent
Okay.
on the type of use of the data. Second is making sure that unnecessary data is not leaking into the models. So making sure the personal information is kind of scanned out. The other piece is when you're working on this chatbot, you may fine tune your model or something. And then what happens is there's the same data sprawl that we talked about that could happen in your AI pipelines that is
Yes.
pumping this data into the model to fine tune or continuous learning, whatever you talk about. And the third would be this cross border data localization that we talked about, right? Depending on the type of business that you're running. If it is a global business, I would say, be careful about that. If it is a local business, then you're a little more protected and you have everything processed within here. So I would say those would be kind of the top ones you want to think about.
Super. So, and when it comes to challenges that are imposed by DPDP for traditional or classical AI systems vis-a-vis Gen AI, systems,
Yeah.
is there anything different or the rules are the same for that?
The rules are the same, but I think the complexity of the architecture becomes different
Okay.
because, with generative AI and language models, earlier we
Hmm.
never had the compute for language models. So
Correct.
now what's happening is we are dumping a lot of multimodal data into these models, which we never did earlier in the traditional world, if you call it the traditional world, right? Like the machine learning, where we were doing like forecasting or linear
Correct.
regression things, simple things like that. So I think from that concept, it's a lot more data that is being shared with these models, and the
Sure.
complexity of architectures and different pieces in your architecture has increased. So that would be the challenge that I would say a lot of people are going to face.
Okay, so complexity and the number of moving parts is what you're saying that people have to watch out for. So great. I mean,
Yes.
so thanks for those practical, tips for for folks and builders with AI. So the next part is really something that we talked about earlier, which is that DPDP seems to have a bunch of penalties and consequences for breaches, right?
Yes.
So if you could double click on that a little bit, what are the consequences if an enterprise or a business or a startup is not careful
Mhm.
and the tech teams make a mistake?
I think the consequences can be very drastic,
Okay,
depending on how bad of a leak it is and what your business is doing. The biggest consequence I tell people is your customer trust and your company reputation.
absolutely.
Because, once there's like, oh my God, you guys leaked my data, I'm not going to come back. So that is a big one. There's, of course, a 250 crore penalty. And
Did you just
that
say
is a
250 crores?
yes,
Okay, you,
250
you you just said it as though it was not much, and we just can just move on to the next topic. Okay.
It is huge. I
Okay.
mean, this could shut down companies. Think about it, like
Exactly my
250
point.
crores of company penalties is it's literally, I think, it's I call it the scaring, tactic. It's like it's completely out of my reach. I don't even have that much money to run my own business, and you're telling me that's the fine that I'm going
Exactly.
to get. So it'll shut down companies if it's not done right, and it will kind of a large enterprises who could maybe afford the 250 crore fine. It impacts reputation drastically. So I think those the biggest consequence is the fines.
So, I mean, and you're saying this 250 crores applies regardless of the size of the enterprise or the startup from where the breach happened.
So that is what we are waiting for the enforcement rules to come,
Okay.
right? Because what we know is the penalties, but the details of how that is going to be applied and the enforcement, we are still kind of waiting a little bit for that.
We spoke about, the penalty, but could you
Mhm.
sort of just walk our audience through what is a data breach and are they different kinds?
I think when you think of a data breach, right? First, let's unpack like the word data. Like
Okay.
you're not talking about all the data that you have. You're talking about the data that someone could maliciously use and benefit out of, and which will adversely impact the person whose data it is, right? That is the information we are talking about. And that's critical because most of the time the breaches are happening because of leak of 1% of your data. 1% to 1 to 2% of your data is actually the sensitive data that is worth the leak. Now, when
Absolutely.
a breach happens, someone maliciously has gotten access to your data. Now, the breaches happen through different things, right? There are times where it's an insider job where someone has downloaded a bunch of information and taken it away. The other could be access. Someone's got access through some credentials or something like that. So those are the different kind of ways that you get access to it. And from a data breach standpoint, it is all about the sensitive data like your Aadhaar card, Aadhaar number, your account number, your PAN number, all of those things getting breached is what constitutes an actual data breach.
Okay. No, thanks for unpacking that. I hope this is giving clarity to our audience. So now that we spoke about the punitive, and the impact and the consequences, um, let's talk a little bit about how enterprises and startups and businesses can actually approach this, right? I mean, how do they protect their interests, and more importantly, that of their customers?
First thing I tell people is figure out what data you're collecting from the customer. And then, first things first, we have a problem a lot of times about collecting more data than we need because we just think, oh, if I have more, I'll be able to do a lot more.
Correct.
That's great. You can. But then, with more data comes more responsibility to, handle all of that safely. And most of the time, when you're not using all the data, you forget about the data that you've collected and not used. And that's what creates more issues. So, the first thing I would say is data minimization, right?
Okay.
Make sure that you're collecting only the amount of data that you need, not more than that. Second thing would be around, and I think this is a big pillar of DPDPA, is consent. Even when you're collecting this amount of data, make sure you are collecting the purpose, and consent has to be purpose driven. So I can give you my data for you to send me marketing information, but I am not consenting for you to give that data to someone else to market, right? Only you can market to me, someone else can't. And then when you get into data of children, right? That is also another big piece because now you have delegated consent. So I think there is a whole piece around consent architecture that is extremely important for people to think about. And there's also pieces around monitoring, traceability, governance, making sure that you know what's happening with this data within your four walls or in your architecture. That's also critical. And one of the key things I tell people who are, everyone doesn't have the luxury of this, but if you do, we have this whole concept of privacy by design, privacy first architecture, right? And the whole idea there is don't think of all of these privacy and security things as an afterthought. If you
Okay.
think of it as you're building something, and especially now, if we are just on the beginning of our AI journey, right? Let's put it in from the beginning because otherwise the price is going to be pretty high. Like I'll give you an example, right? There was one company, I won't name them. There was a small startup. They were building a new model. They didn't realize that they were training the model with sensitive data. And then when they went on to actually put the model out in the world, they couldn't. And think about what happened. They had to retrain the whole model all over again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Imagine the amount of money they spent to train the model. And a model is such that it's not like you can take half of it and carve it out. The whole thing is junk, and you have to
Correct.
start at the beginning. So that, these are some things. I think the privacy first part becomes a little more critical when you think of like AI workflows, really.
No, superbly summed up, Amrita. I mean, so you said data minimization, and then you basically said consent, and not only consent, but also consent architecture with the governance part of it. And then you said privacy by design. And, of course, you said don't do all these three things as an afterthought, but make
Yes.
them part of your entire build process, right?
Yes.
And then sort of see how to actually build with these principles in mind. So if you're a product manager or a tech manager looking at this podcast, please remember that that's the biggest mind shift change that you need to bring, which is that you need to build all this ground up and not as an afterthought, because as Amrita outlined, the cost of actually doing this after you deploy something is going to be far, far more than if you actually start thinking about it, from first principles or from, as you actually start building. Amrita, what are three technical decisions that could have a big impact on DPDP?
So if you're doing something now in the next, like let's say 30 days,
Because you'll be moving faster than many others, because this is going to be definitely something that's going to be a minimum barrier to entry, which many people have to now adopt.
but if you're getting into model training, I will always caution people about the fact that I said that models will never forget anything.
For a small startup or for an enterprise, because if they were using cheap global storage, so suddenly they can't do this. How should they think about this trade off?
I think the biggest mistake is what I've talked about a lot around like privacy.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Neural Talks. Hit subscribe or follow us on LinkedIn to stay informed of many more great episodes on AI coming up. We're the Neural, where humans meet AI.